The sun sagged low over the horizon, its last light pouring like molten copper across the plains. Dust hung in the air, stirred by the slow, rhythmic gait of Elias Crow's horse. The saddle leather creaked in time with his breathing, and the wind pressed cool against his jaw, carrying with it the faint scent of rain far to the east. A hawk turned lazy circles above him, its cry sharp against the wide silence. Then came another sound, faint, strained, threads of human voices unraveling in the wind. A shout. A woman's cry. Elias pulled the reins without thinking, the horse's head swinging toward a dry riverbed that ran pale and cracked beneath the dying light. He saw them before they saw him, 2 men in dust-stained coats, their boots planted wide, one gripping a rope that bit into the wrists of the woman between them. She stood tall despite her bindings, black hair streaming in the wind, eyes fixed on something far beyond them. The men spoke in that lazy drawl that hid a mean edge, laughing low between words. Elias dismounted, his boots hitting the earth with a muted thud, and began walking toward them with a slowness that left no room for misreading. His voice, when it came, was calm. "Let her go." The man with the rope smirked. "Ain't your business, friend." "It is now." Elias's hand rested on the butt of his Colt, not gripping it, just letting them know it was there. The hawk cried again overhead. The rope holder shifted his weight, and in that pause, a gust swirled dust into the men's eyes. Elias moved, a sudden, precise strike knocking the rifle from the other's hand. The second man stumbled back, swearing, and the first loosened his grip long enough for Elias to yank the rope free. The woman didn't run. She simply stepped back, watching him with a look that gave nothing away. The hunters cursed and retreated, their threats tossed over their shoulders like scraps. Elias unwound the rope from her wrist. "Water?" he asked, pulling a canteen from his saddlebag. She shook her head and began walking toward the distant ridge without a word. He followed, keeping a respectful space between them. By the time they reached Sundown Ridge, the sky had bled into indigo. Oil lamps glowed in the windows of the clapboard buildings, and the smell of cooking meat drifted from the inn. Folks slowed their steps when they saw them, eyes flicking from Elias to the woman, then back. Sheriff Boone Mallory stepped into their path, hands resting easy on his belt, his gaze sliding over Ahiona like she was a problem he'd already decided on. "Evening, Crow. You bringing trouble into my town?" "Bringing someone who needed help," Elias said evenly. Boone's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "We've got our own folks to look after. She don't belong here." His voice was low, but it carried. Elias ignored it, leading her past him toward the inn. Maeve Hollister met them at the door, her apron dusted with flour. She offered a quick, warm glance to Ahiona before looking at Elias. "You know what they'll say," she murmured. He nodded once, the words settling heavy but not surprising. By morning, whispers had bloomed like burrs. Mrs. Winfield leaned out her store window, whispering to 2 women who nodded sharply in the direction of the inn. Jonas Pike, the ranch hand who sometimes worked Elias's fence lines, asked outright why he'd risk his hide for one of them. Elias didn't answer. He carried with him the smell of smoke from a night long ago, the burning of a village, the screams carried away on wind, and the stillness that followed. He'd never forgotten the faces. He doubted he ever would. Inside the inn's small dining room, Ahiona sat by the window, her untouched supper cooling before her. "The wind here smells like anger," she said without looking at him. It was the first time she'd spoken to him since the riverbed. Over the next days, they moved around each other in small, unspoken rhythms. Elias repaired her worn moccasins one evening, stitching leather by the light of a kerosene lamp. The next morning, his trail coat, torn at the shoulder, was mended neatly, the work fine and even. Neither of them mentioned the exchange. She worked in the kitchen with Maeve, silent but steady, while outside the air thickened with rumor. Some men at the saloon spoke openly about driving her out before she brought bad luck. Elias heard them, and though his jaw tightened, he said nothing. One morning he found her in the corral. A young colt, usually skittish, pressed its nose against her palm, breathing slow. She moved with a quiet certainty, her free hand brushing the animal's mane, whispering something Elias couldn't hear. Watching them, he thought of how some creatures survive not by force, but by never letting go of themselves. The narrator's thought, his own thought, came unbidden. In a world that loves the sound of its own boots, quiet grace is the loudest rebellion. Still, the distance between them held. In the evenings, they shared the same table, the same lamplight, yet spoke little. Sometimes she would glance toward the window, watching the street with an expression Elias could not name, part defiance, part waiting. And sometimes he caught himself wanting to ask what it was she saw out there. One night, near closing, Maeve leaned over Elias's table. "The two you tangled with, they're back. Saw them at the saloon." Her voice was hushed, but the weight in it was solid. Elias looked toward the door, the street beyond lit only by a thin slice of moon. Somewhere in the distance, the hawk called again, though the hour was wrong for it. Upstairs, in the small room Maeve had given her, Ahiona stood by the window, her hands resting on the sill. She didn't turn when Elias stepped inside. "They're here for me," she said, as if stating the color of the sky. He came to stand beside her, the lamplight falling across the line of her jaw, the dark spill of her hair. "They won't take you," he said. Her eyes met his, steady, unreadable. "It's not just them," she murmured. "It's the whole town. You can't fight the wind." He wanted to tell her he'd fought worse, that he'd stood against things that had already taken everything from him. But her voice was quiet in the shadowed room, and there was a truth in it that felt older than either of them. She stepped past him toward the door, her movements as fluid as water finding its path. "You should let me go," she said. And before he could answer, she was gone into the hallway, her footsteps fading toward the back stairs. Elias stood in the empty room, the night air drifting in through the open window. Somewhere outside, boots moved in the street, slow, deliberate. He knew the sound of men who had already decided what they'd do. He also knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones, that if she walked out of Sundown Ridge alone, he might never see her again. And the thought struck him harder than he expected, like the sudden ache of an old wound he thought had healed. Rain fell in restless threads against the inn's roof, the kind that blurred the lamplight into halos and made the street a ribbon of dark glass. Elias sat in the dim corner of the dining room, his untouched coffee cooling beside him, listening to the low murmur of voices upstairs. Maeve had gone to bed hours earlier, leaving the place to the soft creak of timbers and the rain's steady drumming. Every so often he caught the shuffle of boots outside, a sound too measured to belong to passers-by. They were waiting. A door above opened, and Ahiona descended the narrow staircase. Her hair clung to her shoulders in loose, damp strands, her moccasins silent on the wooden steps. She carried no bag, no blanket, only herself, moving like a shadow that had chosen its own direction. Elias stood as she reached the bottom. "You can't just walk into them," he said. Her gaze lifted to his, unreadable. "If I stay, they'll keep circling. And one night, you won't be awake to stop them." The rain struck harder, rattling the shutters. He stepped closer. "Then I'll stay awake." She shook her head, her voice quiet but firm. "I will not be the reason you lose what little peace you have left." He followed her to the back door, the cold air spilling in as she opened it. Beyond lay the corral, the fence dark with rain, the hills beyond smudged into shadow. "Do you think I'm afraid of them?" he asked. Her hand paused on the latch. "No. I think you're afraid of what will happen if you stay with me." The words caught him off guard, not because they weren't true, but because they named the ache he hadn't dared touch. She slipped out into the downpour before he could speak. The night swallowed her quickly, her shape melting into the dark as if the rain itself had claimed her. Elias grabbed his coat and stepped into the storm. The wind pushed at him, cold and smelling of wet earth, and the mud pulled at his boots with every step. Lightning flared in the distance, and for a moment he saw her, a dark figure moving fast toward the ridge. He quickened his pace, the rain seeping through his collar, the sound of his breathing loud against the storm's howl. She reached the old riverbed before him, her steps sure on the slick stone. Two shapes emerged from the gloom, the hunters, broad and solid, their rifles slung low. The taller one grinned through the rain. "Looks like she saved us the trouble." The shorter one spat into the mud. "You're coming with us, girl. Easiest coin we'll make all week." Ahiona didn't move. Her chin lifted, and the rain streamed down her face like glass threads. Elias stepped into the circle of their lamplight, his presence slowing the air. The taller man's grin faltered. "You again." Elias didn't draw. Instead, he stood between them, the rain plastering his hair to his brow. His voice was low, steady, the kind a man uses when he's already measured the cost. "I've seen what men like you leave behind. I've seen the fires you don't put out, the faces you don't bury because you can't bear to look. You think you're chasing coin, but you're carrying ghosts, and they'll follow you until you break." The shorter man shifted, uneasy. The taller scoffed, but his eyes flickered. "She's worth good money, Crow. Step aside." Elias took one step forward. "No. Not tonight." The wind cut through them, snapping at coat hems. The hunter's lamplight trembled in the rain. For a long moment no one moved. Then the shorter man muttered a curse and turned, trudging back toward the ridge. The taller lingered, the lines of his jaw working, before spitting into the mud and following. The night closed in behind them, the sound of their boots swallowed by the storm. Ahiona's breath came in a sharp exhale, though her face remained steady. Elias looked at her, the rain running into the lines of his weathered skin. Neither spoke for a moment. The storm roared above them, and somewhere high in the dark the hawk cried again, impossibly out of place. She met his gaze, and for the first time, her eyes did not guard themselves. He saw there the weight she carried, not just fear, but the long ache of losing too much and expecting it to be taken again. She stepped toward him, close enough for him to see the fine tremble in her lashes. "You could have died," she said. "I've been dying a little each day anyway," he answered. They walked back together, side by side, their shoulders brushing once as if by accident. The rain softened as they reached the edge of town, the lamps glowing in blurred halos. Inside the corral, the young colt lifted its head at the sound of her step and came to the fence, nuzzling her sleeve. She smiled, small, fleeting, but it caught Elias in the chest like a warm knife. He realized then that her leaving hadn't just been about keeping herself safe. It had been her last act of control in a world determined to take it from her. By morning, the town wore the quiet of aftermath. Boone Mallory passed Elias in the street, giving only a curt nod. Gossip still bloomed in doorways, but it was softer now, like the muttering of a wind that had lost its sharp edge. Maeve set coffee on Elias's table without asking, her eyes meeting his with something that might have been respect. Ahiona moved through the corral, the colt following her like a shadow. She did not look toward him, but he didn't need her to. The sight of her there, unbound, standing in the pale light, was enough. Elias leaned against the fence, his fingers resting on the worn wood. The ache in his chest was still there, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the hollow ache of loss, but something heavier, more intricate, threaded with a strange peace. He understood now that whatever had passed between them in the rain wasn't something to be claimed. It was a moment, and like all moments, it could only be carried, not kept. The hawk's cry sounded again, faint and far, and he looked to the sky but saw nothing. The air smelled of wet earth and something faintly sweet, like the ghost of a flower after bloom. Ahiona paused in her work and glanced toward the ridge, her face unreadable. The light caught in her eyes, and for a heartbeat Elias thought she might speak. But she only turned back to the colt, her hand moving slow along its neck. He stayed at the fence, watching, knowing there were things worth standing for even if you never got to hold them. And somewhere in that stillness, he understood that losing his heart to her had not been a mistake at all, It had been the only honest thing he'd done in years.